Afternoon, I'm Müürsepp, the Association of Pharmaceutical Manufacturer. First of all, I'd like to say that I'm not personally familiar with Rett syndrome. I've come to tell you about the accessibility of orphan drugs in general.
Et alustuseks, mis on harvikravimi
To begin with, what are the criteria of designating a drug an orphan drug? There are three chief criteria. First of all, it has to be rare. In the EU, the criterion is 5 patients per 10,000 people. But there is more than the rarity. Another criterion is the severity of the disease. For the designation, the disease has to be potentially deadly or chronically debilitating. And thirdly, there has to be either no alternative to the drug, or it would have to be vastly better than the existing alternatives. And when assessing the potential of a new drug, we would have to keep in mind the three conditions: whether the disease is rare, whether there is an alternative, and how beneficial the treatment would be. So in Estonia, the criteria are known to all, logical. Whether there is a need for treatment, is the treatment efficacious? We won't be talking in depth about these aspects because on the Rare Disease Day, we would like to focus on orphan drugs specifically. For orphan drugs, there are two key aspects in turn. On the one hand, the three criteria we already mentioned. How rare is rare? Is there an alternative? How debilitating is the disease? And secondly, the additional aspect, the price. These drugs are significantly more expensive than the drugs for more common diseases. The number of patients is the most simple to regulate and communicate the numbers. Life, however, rarely fits with rules. In Estonia, the criterion is that there have to be just a few patients for a drug for whom the funding threshold is higher. And the next step is when there is a couple dozen patients needing a drug for whom the funding threshold is also higher than normal, than the baseline funding. And then there are exceptions. Normally, when a drug is needed by more than a couple dozen patients, then those drugs won't be considered as orphan drugs, or the diseases won't be considered as rare diseases in Estonia. However, in rare specific cases when there is no alternative and the treatment is highly efficacious, then the Ministry of Health has found a way to create an exception. Case in point, a couple of days ago, at the Rare Disease Day, we discussed the case of cystic fibrosis. We have more than a couple dozen individuals suffering from cystic fibrosis in Estonia. However, the disease is debilitating, and the treatment was funded. In general, what makes the treatment of rare diseases accessible? First of all, flexibility. Data about rare diseases is frequently sparse. Studies are difficult to carry out. There are very few patients, and there are no alternatives. In general, good studies have control groups However, control groups consist of patients with no treatment. And the question arises, how long can you ethically carry out a study where the intervention group is benefiting from the treatment and the control group is not? And so we come to the ministry saying we got data about for half a year or a year because we weren't ethically able to retain a control group without treatment. And so we consider sparse data than with more common diseases, and we have fewer data to base our decision on. This is inevitable. A lot is decided by funding. How much is Estonia willing to pay for one life year?
Ja tänane konverents on patsientide hääl.
This conference focuses on the voice of patients.
Patsientide hääl on tähtis kahes kohas. Üks on see, et
The voice of patients is important twofold. First of all, funding orphan drugs requires a degree of solidarity in society. And in order for politicians and society to display solidarity, they have to know about the nature of rare diseases. If you don't know, if you don't see rare diseases, if you're not aware, you can't do solidarity. And secondly, patient's voice is important for evaluation. When we have enough data, we build an economic assessment model. It includes the patient's quality of life, but the number is abstract. For the treatment funding committee, what matters is people to tell them in their own words about their quality of life with that treatment. If we can create a model, the model also involves the patient's quality of life, but it can't include a lot of aspects related to the patient. We attempt to include the caregiving burden. Sometimes we succeed in including it, sometimes we don't. But can we include the child's educational improvement? Is this part of quality of life? We don't know, maybe rather not. So for the patient's voice, when they tell the committee about life with a disease and about the effect of the treatment on the patient's life in the long term, whether the patient can handle education, school, work, what kind of work they can do, whether the treatment course can be adhered to in reality is important. What else is important in the accessibility of treatment? Rules are important, but we shouldn't be victims of our own rules. The current funding limit is a couple dozen patients for additional funding. But what do you do if the disease is severe, but the number of patients is slightly over the threshold? In this case, the decision makers have to have some flexibility to make for exceptions that are in line with the idea or the point of the regulation, even if not with a letter. Like with cystic fibrosis, the letter was not precisely followed, the letter of law was not precisely followed, but the situation was severe enough to find a solution. Now, about have there been positive developments in what and where would we expect more developments to follow? One positive development is a new health technology assessment guideline. It's It brings more clarity. There's a discount rate matching the discount rate at hand in the rest of Europe, meaning drugs that have a long-term benefit are favored a bit more in the algorithm. This is a slight improvement in the evaluation. And the next speaker will talk about the evaluation process. I won't dwell on it any longer. The new guidelines bring a new term, high added value technology. For regular drugs, the threshold is quite high. For efficiency, efficacy, and drugs that exceed the efficacy threshold have a higher financing rate. The high added value scheme, however, does not affect situations that ultra-rare or rare diseases are involved. The criteria are listed on the slide, but I think we can move on to the final criterion. The drug has to give more benefit than 3 quality-adjusted life years per patient. There are quite a few orphan drugs offering more than 3 QALYs. 3 QALYs. For common drugs, few of them cross the threshold of 3 QALYs. Payment threshold. However, the funding threshold applied to regular drugs is too low for orphan drugs. Something we'd all see better funded is our healthcare system in general. If we do not update payment thresholds in Estonia, then drug availability in Estonia will fall behind the rest of Europe. I'm not currently able to name specific numbers for funding or payment thresholds. I can only say we can compare ourselves against the European median or average, and/or against Latvia and Lithuania. Latvia has run out of money. However, in Lithuania, certain orphan drugs have better availability than we do in Estonia. And this is the basis on which we are deciding whether Estonian orphan drug availability is currently sufficient. The basis is statistics as compared to the rest of the EU. And secondly, as mentioned, we mustn't make ourselves victims of our own rules. We already mentioned the situation where there are drugs in Estonia that are not orphan drugs as per the rules literally. But as with the cystic fibrosis funding, in cases where the disease is severe, there is no alternative and there's a lot to gain, I would like to hope that we're able to make decisions in Estonia that adhere to the idea of the law, not to the letter of the law, for drugs to reach those most in need. And finally, innovative drugs save people's health. Oftentimes, they bring savings in the rest of the healthcare systems, and they support economy in general. Statistics show that €1 invested in healthcare brings up to €4 to society in return. And the treatment of rare disease is a matter of justice in a society. Thank you.
Suur tänu, Ravimite Tootjate Liidu liige Andres Müürsepp.
Thank you, Andres Müürsepp, member of the Association of Pharmaceutical Manufacturers. A question. Did I understand correctly that the healthcare funding assessment regulation is not well applicable to orphan drugs? That this high added value guideline was created to find the most efficacious regular drugs, and the need of a similar scheme for orphan drugs was not really considered. Let me come back to the same example. There was a case where a drug was needed by more than a couple dozen patients, and they were granted it. Currently, if there was a specific scheme for orphan drugs, it might be useful. Next question. Thank you for the presentation. It's me again. I'd like to ask. Oftentimes, drugs are evaluated by the years a person gains in expected lifetime. But with rare drugs, it's as if we're buying in skills. I got a specific example when we started treating older patients with spinal atrophy. They gained the ability to sit up all day and work on the computer. Or with Rett syndrome, children who are able to use their hands while they couldn't use their arms or hands before. So how do we bring in this gain of skills into the algorithm, the improvement of everyday quality of life? I'll put my answer in plain language. In the technical model, there is a life quality coefficient, but this is abstract, and as I said before, it doesn't include the surroundings of the patient. And what helps here is the patient describing their life with the drug, with the treatment, whether they're able to sit up in school, whether they're able to write, maybe the parent will help with writing it down. These are all things we're not able to capture into criteria, but we would like to take it into account when making our decisions. Did it answer your question? Right, thank you. New question. The expensive drugs saving money elsewhere in healthcare, for example, in intensive care. Is this taken into account? Yes, as much as we can. In Estonia, adoption of a new drug can take 1,040 days, whereas as in the rest of Europe, it can take much lower, 45 days. Why does the adoption of new drugs take longer in Estonia? Let me come back to Estonia spending less on healthcare than the rest of Europe on average. We can look at single cases, but our main root cause is that we need to make more investments into healthcare. We have to make investments to the level of the European average if we want to reach the European average. If I remember correctly, in the EU, total healthcare spend is 7.3% in Estonia, whereas it's 10% in Europe, private and public sector together. Right? So, member of the Pharmaceutical Manufacturers Association, Andres Müürsepp.